Holy crap, folks. Imagine waking up to the sound of chainsaws and realizing they're on your land, tearing through trees your great-grandfather planted 2 centuries ago. That's exactly what happened to me. My first instinct? Grab a shovel and swing. But I held back, barely, because evidence speaks louder than broken noses. What I didn't expect was that the HOA would double down and then get slapped with handcuffs by the police chief himself. It got real fast. I'm curious, would this fly where you live? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's see how wild HOAs are across the country. You're watching QA Stories. Let's get into it. Let me start from the beginning, because honestly, I never thought I'd be telling a story like this. I guess I never thought I'd be the kind of guy to end up in a legal battle with anyone, let alone the homeowners association. I mean, I'm not a fighter. Not really. My name's Jasper Vance. I'm 40 years old and I make my living as a wood sculptor. Not the kind of work that makes you rich, but it keeps food on the table and lets me live exactly how I want to live. Quietly, peacefully, on the same piece of land my family's called home for generations. This ranch, man, it's been in my family for 2 centuries. 200 years. My great-grandfather planted these massive oak trees with his own hands, and they've been the soul of our family legacy ever since. I'm talking about trees so old and so beautiful that people used to drive out of their way just to see them. Living cathedrals that had watched over my family through wars, depressions, and everything else history could throw at us. Every morning I'd sit under those oaks with my coffee, watching the sunrise filter through their branches, feeling connected to something bigger than myself. My life was simple, free-spirited, drawing inspiration from nature and family history. I'd spend my days carving intricate pieces from fallen branches, selling them at local markets, living off the land in the most honest way I knew how. The ranch wasn't fancy. Hell, it probably looked downright rustic compared to the newer developments that had been popping up around us. But it was home. It was peaceful. It was mine. Looking back, I should have known that something this beautiful, this pure, would eventually attract the wrong kind of attention. I just never imagined it would come from the very people who were supposed to protect property rights. But that's exactly what happened when Agnes Peabody moved into our neighborhood and decided my family's heritage was somehow her business to control. Enter Agnes Peabody, 60 years old, former urban development specialist, and the newly elected president of our homeowners association. Now, I want to be fair here. I'm sure Agnes thought she was doing the right thing, but this woman, she had this rigid, control-obsessed personality that made my skin crawl from day one. She'd moved to our area about 2 years ago, and within 6 months, she'd managed to get herself elected to the HOA board. Within a year, she was running the whole show. Agnes had this fixation on what she called modern community standards, and apparently, my 200-year-old ranch didn't fit her vision of contemporary landscape development. What really bothered me was finding out later that 20 years ago, she'd actually written newspaper articles about removing outdated structures for contemporary landscape development, which I guess now included my entire life. Should have been a red flag right there, but honestly, I wasn't paying attention to HOA politics. I was too busy living my life, minding my own business, assuming everyone else would do the same. Maybe that was naive of me. I don't know. But Agnes clearly saw my property as some kind of personal project that needed her expert touch. The first violation notice showed up on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I remember because I was working on a particularly complex piece, a carved eagle that had been giving me trouble for weeks, when I heard footsteps on my porch. Agnes herself had delivered it, though she didn't stick around to chat. The letter claimed my trees exceed height regulations and were blocking sunlight for neighboring properties. I read it twice, thinking there had to be some mistake. These were oak trees, for crying out loud. They'd been here since before there was even a neighborhood to have sunlight issues with. The whole thing seemed so absurd that I crumpled up the letter and tossed it in with the chicken coop liner. Figured that was the end of it. Boy, was I wrong. The second notice arrived the following week, and this time Agnes had escalated her complaints to include falling leaves creating sanitation violations. Sanitation violations from leaves. Was I really going to end up in a shouting match over autumn leaves? I was starting to get annoyed, but I still thought this was just Agnes being Agnes. You know, the neighborhood busybody who couldn't sleep at night unless she was picking a fight with someone. Oh great, it's Agnes the busybody again, I thought to myself. She probably couldn't sleep last night, so decided to pick a fight with someone today. I ignored that letter too, figuring she'd eventually find someone else to bother. Looking back, maybe I should have taken it more seriously, but come on, who writes violation notices about leaves falling from trees? The third letter came 10 days later, and this one really got under my skin. Now she was claiming my tree root systems posed potential drainage hazards to the community's infrastructure. I stared at that one for a long time, feeling this creeping sense of disbelief mixed with something darker. These trees had been here for 2 centuries. If they were going to cause drainage problems, wouldn't that have happened by now? I read the third letter and felt something shift inside me. Not laughter this time, but a cold realization that someone was systematically building a case against me. More like, are these people serious right now? The absurdity of it all was starting to wear on me, but I still couldn't believe anyone would take these complaints seriously. By the time the fourth letter arrived, this one labeled as a final warning, I was starting to feel genuinely uneasy. Agnes was giving me 30 days to modify landscaping compliance or face what she called heavy penalties. The language felt like some authority figure issuing ultimatums, with hints about enforcement action if I didn't cooperate. That's when it hit me that Agnes wasn't just being difficult. She was building some kind of case against me, step by step, violation by violation. I remember sitting under my favorite oak tree that evening, hearing what sounded like strange rustling in the wind. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe it was guilt whispering that I'd ignored the storm coming. I kept hearing my great-grandfather's words echoing in my head. Each of these oak trees is a soul, Jasper, a piece of our family's story. That night, I decided I needed to investigate what Agnes was really up to. I wasn't thinking about legal action yet, honestly. I still hoped this would all blow over, but something deep in my gut was telling me this wasn't going to end with just letters. The way she'd been escalating her complaints, the official language, the threats about enforcement action, it all felt like she was building towards something bigger. I couldn't tell if I was creating unnecessary worry or if this was actually a warning from my ancestors that I needed to take more seriously than I had been. I woke up that Tuesday morning to the sound of chainsaws. Not the distant hum you hear when someone's trimming branches down the road. I'm talking about the full-throated roar of industrial equipment, close enough that it felt like it was happening in my bedroom. I nearly tripped over my boots getting to the window. My mind was still foggy, but my gut knew this wasn't just noise. It was barely 6 a.m., and for a split second, I thought maybe I was having some kind of nightmare. The sound was so violent, so wrong for that peaceful morning hour, that my brain refused to accept what I was hearing. But as I stumbled to the window and looked outside, the nightmare became real. There was a work crew on my property, actively cutting down my ancient oak trees. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that seeing those chainsaws biting into 200-year-old bark was like watching someone murder my family members. The sound alone was enough to make me physically sick, but the sight of those massive trunks starting to lean and fall, I've never felt rage like that in my entire life. It was pure, white-hot fury, mixed with disbelief that anyone could be so brazenly destructive. I threw on whatever clothes I could find and ran outside, shouting at the top of my lungs for them to stop. The foreman, this thick-set guy with dead eyes and work gloves covered in sawdust, barely looked up when I approached. He had this mechanical way of moving, like he'd done this exact job 100 times before, and my property was just another item on his checklist. "We're just following orders, sir," he said, like that explained everything. His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was discussing the weather instead of destroying centuries of family history. I snapped back at him. "Would you do this if it were a war memorial?" He didn't answer, just gestured toward his crew to keep working. When I tried to get closer to the trees, to somehow physically intervene, maybe throw myself between the chainsaws and the bark, the foreman actually shoved me away, not gently either. Hard enough that I stumbled backward and nearly fell. Looking back, I'm amazed I didn't take a swing at him right then and there. The only thing that stopped me was knowing that assault charges would just make everything worse. But watching those ancient giants fall while I stood there helpless, it was the most powerless I've ever felt in my entire life. That's when Agnes appeared, walking across my yard like she owned the place. She had this smug expression on her face, not quite a smile, but something that let me know she was enjoying every second of this. There was a satisfaction in her eyes that made my stomach turn, like she'd been planning this moment for months and was finally getting to see her handiwork in action. "You violated community standards," she announced, like she was reading from a script. "This is necessary action to maintain neighborhood integrity and safety for everyone." She said it like she was quoting scripture. Meanwhile, my history lay bleeding behind her. Necessary action for trees that had been standing since before her grandparents were born. I asked her what gave her the right to come onto my property and destroy my trees without so much as a phone call. She pulled out a folder thick with official-looking documents and started rattling off legal jargon about property compliance and community authority. Most of it went over my head, but the message was clear. She believed she had every right to do exactly what she was doing, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. The way she spoke, so confident and dismissive, made it clear she'd done her homework and felt completely protected by whatever legal framework she was operating under. I called the police, thinking surely this was some kind of crime, trespassing, destruction of property, something. My hands were shaking as I dialed, partly from rage and partly from disbelief that I was watching my family's heritage being systematically destroyed in broad daylight. 2 officers showed up about 20 minutes later, and I explained the situation as calmly as I could manage. "But you know what they told me? This is a civil dispute, sir. You'll need to hire an attorney." A civil dispute? While my family's heritage was being systematically destroyed in front of my eyes? I wanted to scream. Instead, I nodded like a good citizen while my voice shook explaining what they were doing. The officers were polite enough, but they made it clear they weren't going to intervene. They suggested I contact my insurance company and find a lawyer. Then they left. Just left. I stood there watching them drive away, while the chainsaws kept roaring behind me, feeling completely abandoned by the system I'd always assumed would protect people like me. It was like discovering that everything I thought I knew about property rights and basic decency was just an illusion. By the time the work crew finished, several of my most beautiful oak trees were lying on the ground like corpses. Tree sap was bleeding out of the cut stumps, and I swear it looked like tears. The workers loaded their equipment with the same mechanical efficiency they'd used to destroy my trees, while Agnes stood there looking triumphant. She even had the nerve to hand me a bill for landscaping services before she left. A bill for cutting down my own trees. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, literally could not process that someone could be so brazen, so coldly calculating. "Payment is due within 30 days, she said, like this was just another business transaction. I watched her walk away, and something fundamental shifted inside me. The rage was still there, but it was transforming into something colder, more focused. This wasn't just about trees anymore. This was about Agnes thinking she could roll over people like me without consequences. I started filming everything with my phone. The damage, the scattered branches, the devastated landscape where my beautiful oaks used to stand. I scooped up a handful of wood chips, cold, damp, splintered, and swore I'd make every one of them count. I thought I understood the rules of this game, but apparently Agnes was playing something completely different. The next few days were a blur of research and dead ends. I spent hours at the local library, digging through property records and municipal codes, trying to understand exactly what rights Agnes and her HOA actually had. The librarian, a sweet elderly woman with sharp eyes and a patient voice, tried to help me navigate the legal databases, but even she seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of municipal law. Reading city codes was like drowning in molasses. At one point, I swear I Googled, "What is municipal landscaping compliance?" and got recipes. Half the legal documents were written in language so dense I might as well have been reading ancient Greek. I found references to homeowner association authority, community compliance standards, landscaping regulations, but nothing that clearly explained how someone could just show up on your property and cut down trees that had been there for centuries. I kept thinking there had to be some obvious law or precedent that would make Agnes's actions illegal, but if there was, I sure couldn't find it. Maybe I just didn't know where to look, or maybe the system really was set up to favor people like Agnes over people like me. Either way, I was starting to feel like I was in way over my head, drowning in legal jargon while my family's legacy lay in pieces on my lawn. That's when Earl Peterson showed up at my door. Earl, everyone called him Whisper because of his habit of speaking so quietly you had to lean in to hear him, was my neighbor to the east, a retired forest ranger who'd lived in the area even longer than my family had. Earl was one of those guys who seemed to know everything about local history, the kind of person who could tell you stories about every old building and landmark for miles around. He'd been watching the tree cutting from his property, and I guess he felt compelled to come over and share his condolences. "I remember your grandfather mentioning something about those tree markings being sacred," he told me in that whisper, quiet voice of his. I asked him what he meant by sacred, but he said just enough to make me uneasy, and then went quiet. He didn't explain clearly, just hinted that there might be more to the story than I realized. Classic Earl, giving you just enough information to make you curious, but never enough to actually help. I was struggling with more than just legal research, though. The truth is, I was starting to doubt myself in ways that surprised me. Maybe Agnes was right. Maybe I was just some stubborn guy clinging to the past while the rest of the world moved forward. My neighbors weren't exactly rallying to my defense. In fact, most of them seemed to be avoiding me altogether. I'd see them checking their mail or working in their yards, but the moment I approached, they'd suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. One guy actually pretended not to see me when I waved. Another turned their car around mid-driveway. Even the nosy neighbor from 3 houses down crossed the street when she saw me coming. It was like I'd become toxic overnight. The neighborhood troublemaker who couldn't accept progress. I spent a lot of time sitting under the few trees Agnes had left untouched, wondering if I was crazy for fighting the entire system over what some people might see as just landscaping. Was I making a mountain out of a molehill? Was I letting my emotions cloud my judgment? I honestly didn't know anymore. The isolation was getting to me more than I wanted to admit, and I started questioning whether I was the problem here, not Agnes. That's what led me to Tessa Chambers, a young attorney who specialized in land disputes. I'd found her name in the phone book after calling 6 other lawyers who either didn't return my calls or told me they didn't handle minor property disputes. Tessa's office was in an old, converted house downtown, the kind of place that looked more like someone's living room than a law firm. The walls were lined with law books and case files, but there were also plants everywhere and family photos on her desk that made the space feel more human than most legal offices I'd imagined. She was probably in her early 30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made you feel simultaneously hopeful and intimidated. When I explained my situation, she listened patiently, taking notes and asking the occasional question. Her questions were good ones too, not just about the facts, but about the timeline, the language Agnes had used, the way the whole thing had escalated. I was still clutching a folder like it might magically defend me. My palms had left sweat marks on the paper. But when I finished my story, she was honest in a way that probably wasn't great for business. HOA wins 90% of these property disputes, she told me, and I could see the sympathy in her eyes even as she delivered the bad news. Unless you have documentation proving they violated specific laws or exceeded their authority, you're fighting an uphill battle. I tried to plead my case, explaining about the family history and the significance of those trees, telling her about my great-grandfather's words and the way the land felt sacred to our family. She said it gently, but it still felt like getting punched by a silk glove. I nodded, even as something in me started to unravel. She could see how much this meant to me, but she was also realistic about what we'd be up against. You need way more than feelings and family stories, she said. You need documents, precedents, something concrete that proves Agnes overstepped her bounds. I offered to pay her whatever I could afford, even if it was just in wood carvings or farm produce, but she gently declined to take the case. Not because she didn't want to help, but because she didn't see a path to victory with the evidence I had. I left her office feeling more defeated than ever, wondering if I should just accept that Agnes had won and try to move on with my life. That evening, I sat under one of my surviving trees, clutching those wood chips I'd saved, wondering if I was searching for something that never existed or just didn't know where to look yet. 3 weeks after the tree cutting, we had an unusually cold snap for late spring. I'm talking about the kind of weather that makes you want to build a fire and pretend it's still winter, with temperatures dropping into the 40s and a wind that seemed to cut right through your clothes. The attic was cold enough that my breath fogged the air. Dust danced in beams of morning light, and I remember thinking how time seemed to stop in that room. The old desk creaked like it knew I was finally ready to hear what it had kept quiet for so long. I was rummaging around in the attic, looking for some old firewood I'd stored up there during the fall, when I discovered something that changed everything. There was this ancient desk in the far corner, something that had belonged to my great-grandfather and had been gathering dust for decades. I'd walked past it 1,000 times without giving it much thought, but that day I needed the space underneath it to get to the firewood. When I pulled out the bottom drawer to get to the wood underneath, I noticed the drawer didn't slide all the way out. It was catching on something, making this scraping sound that told me there was more to this piece of furniture than I'd realized. I wiggled it back and forth, getting more frustrated by the minute, until finally I heard a soft crack. The false bottom of the drawer had split open, revealing a hidden compartment I never knew existed. And inside that compartment was a rusted metal box about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in what used to be oilcloth but was now just deteriorated fabric that crumbled when I touched it. My hands were actually shaking as I prized open that box. I'm not sure what I was expecting to find, maybe some old coins or family photos, the kind of stuff people used to hide during the Depression, but what I discovered was so much more significant than anything I could have imagined. There was a meticulous hand-drawn survey map, folded carefully and preserved remarkably well despite its age. The paper had that yellowish tinge that comes with decades of storage, but the ink was still clear, the lines still precise. The map showed our property in incredible detail, with every tree carefully marked and documented with precise measurements, but it was the small handwriting along the margins that made my heart start racing. Sacred Grove. Ancestral land. Protected by city ordinance. I read those words over and over again, not quite believing what I was seeing. I could almost hear his voice reading those words, Protected Grove. Like he'd known, even then, that one day someone would come to take this from us, and he'd left behind a shield I didn't know I needed. My great-grandfather's careful handwriting, documenting something that had been hidden in this desk for God knows how long. Underneath the map was a yellow document that looked official, even though the paper was so old it felt like it might crumble in my hands. It was a city ordinance from the early 1900s, written in that formal legal language they used back then, officially designating the oak grove on our property as specially protected green space for historical preservation. Holy shit, this had been sitting here the entire time. While I was running around feeling helpless and defeated, the legal ammunition I needed was hidden in my own attic, in a piece of furniture I'd walked past countless times without a second thought. I actually said those words out loud, holy shit, even though there was nobody around to hear me. It felt like being struck by lightning, like discovering buried treasure, like getting a message from beyond the grave all at the same time. The document was dated 1897, which meant it had been law for over a century. My great-grandfather hadn't just planted those trees, he'd made sure they were legally protected forever. And somehow, in all the bureaucratic confusion of modern municipal government, everyone had forgotten this ordinance existed. I stared at her number for a long minute. It felt crazy to call so late, but I couldn't sleep knowing this was real. I immediately called Tessa, even though it was almost midnight. I know, calling an attorney at midnight probably isn't the best way to make a good impression, but I couldn't wait until morning. When she answered, I could hear the sleepiness in her voice turn to alert interest as I explained what I'd found. Bring those documents to my office first thing tomorrow morning, she told me. If they're legitimate, this changes everything. Tessa arrived at her office before I did the next morning, which tells you something about how seriously she was taking this development. I got there at 7:30 to find her already at her desk with a pot of coffee and a magnifying glass, ready to examine whatever I'd brought her. She studied the documents with the intensity of a detective investigating a murder case, cross-referring them with municipal records on her computer, making phone calls to the city clerk's office, and spending about 2 hours verifying their authenticity. I sat in her office drinking coffee and trying not to pace, watching her work and feeling like my entire future was hanging in the balance. I kept checking the clock like it might rewind and take the paper with it. When she finally looked up at me, her entire attitude had transformed. This, she said, holding up the ordinance document, is the most fascinating case I've ever seen. We're not just suing the HOA anymore. We're suing a town that completely forgot its own history. The documents were completely legitimate, not just old, but legally valid and still binding under current municipal law. According to that century-old ordinance, cutting down those oak trees was a serious violation of municipal conservation law. Agnes hadn't just overstepped her authority, she'd broken laws that had been on the books since before she was born. But here's where Tessa proved she was worth every penny I couldn't afford to pay her. Instead of rushing straight into court with our newfound evidence, she suggested we play a more strategic game. We're not going to attack directly, she explained, pulling out a legal pad and starting to sketch out a plan. We're going to trick them into providing evidence that they knew about the protected status but deliberately concealed it. If we can prove they knew and acted anyway, this becomes a criminal matter, not just a civil dispute. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Act weak, let Agnes and her HOA think they'd already won, while we quietly built an airtight case behind the scenes. It was risky. If they suspected what we were up to, they might destroy evidence or find ways to cover their tracks. But if we could pull it off, we wouldn't just win a lawsuit. We'd expose a conspiracy that went way deeper than I'd ever imagined. You know, Tessa said with a smile that made me think of a chess master planning several moves ahead, I've shared stories like this before, but this one feels like it could change everything about how we think about property rights and family legacy. I left her office feeling like I was carrying the most powerful weapon possible, but I had no idea if I was smart enough to use it properly. The settlement meeting was held in the conference room at the HOA's management company, one of those sterile corporate spaces with beige walls and uncomfortable chairs that made you feel like you were being processed rather than heard. Everything about that conference room felt alien: sterile air, gray walls, fake plants that looked like they'd never known real sunlight. I felt like I'd stepped onto another planet built by spreadsheets. The fluorescent lighting was harsh and unflattering, casting everything in this sickly, yellowish glow that made even the fake plants in the corner look depressed. Agnes was there, of course, along with 2 other HOA board members I didn't recognize, a nervous-looking man who kept checking his phone, and a woman with perfectly styled hair who seemed bored by the entire proceedings. But the real star of their show was their corporate lawyer, a guy named Silas Blackwood, who looked like he'd stepped out of a 1950s movie about evil businessmen. Expensive suit, slicked back hair, the kind of condescending smile that made you want to punch something. He had this way of looking at you like you were an insect he was considering whether to step on. And every word out of his mouth dripped with the kind of arrogance that comes from never having been challenged by people he considers beneath him. Tessa and I sat across from them at a polished conference table, and I'll be honest, I felt completely out of my element. These people spoke in legal jargon and threw around terms I'd never heard before, while I was just a woodcarver trying to protect what was left of his family's legacy. But that's exactly what Tessa was counting on. She'd coached me beforehand: act confused, act overwhelmed, act like someone who was ready to give up and accept whatever scraps they were willing to throw at me. Let them think they've already won, she'd told me. Overconfident people make mistakes. I'm not an actor. I carve what I see, pretending to be someone I'm not. Well, that felt like whittling lies out of oak. Blackwood started the meeting by presenting what he called a generous settlement offer, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Generous. The offer was so insulting it took all my self-control not to walk out right then and there. They wanted me to accept minimal compensation for my destroyed trees. We're talking about enough money to maybe buy a nice dinner, not replace century-old oaks. Agree to future landscaping compliance under HOA oversight, and essentially surrender any rights to challenge their decisions going forward. In other words, they wanted me to pay them for the privilege of having been victimized by them. Woodcarvers don't usually understand property law complexities, do they? Blackwood said with that smug smile of his, like he was explaining something to a particularly slow child. I had to bite my tongue to keep from telling him exactly what I thought about his property law complexities. Instead, I played my part perfectly. I sighed, I hesitated, I looked confused and defeated. What does this legal clause mean exactly? I asked, pointing to a section of their contract. I only understand wood grain and carving tools. The performance was so convincing that I almost convinced myself. My hands were actually shaking, not from fear, but because for the first time in my life, I was playing chess instead of checkers. I was acting like the simple country boy they expected me to be, while secretly knowing I held cards they couldn't even imagine. Agnes was clearly enjoying every moment of my apparent confusion and defeat. She leaned forward with this predatory gleam in her eyes, explaining in patronizing detail how the HOA had complete authority over community standards, and how resistance would only make things worse for me. "You have to understand, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We're not doing this to be cruel. We're protecting property values for everyone in the community." That's when I made my accidental move. While fumbling through my papers like a confused amateur, I let the protected grove map slip partially out of my folder. Agnes caught a glimpse of it. I saw her eyes widen slightly before she quickly looked away, but I covered it up and pretended not to notice her reaction. She blinked once. Just once. But in that tiny moment, I saw something crack. Something she didn't mean for anyone to see. "Sorry," I mumbled. "Just some old family documents, nothing important." But the seed was planted. I could see her mind working, trying to figure out what that map might mean and whether it posed any threat to her position. But here's where things got really interesting, and where Agnes proved that even smart people can be incredibly stupid when they think they're winning. Drunk on what she thought was her complete victory, she started bragging about her connections with local developers, her voice taking on this boastful tone that revealed way more than she intended. She mentioned a meeting she'd had with Evergreen Development Group about future community improvements, and the moment those words left her mouth, I saw Tessa's pen stop moving across her notepad. I glanced sideways. Tessa hadn't moved, but her pen had stopped mid-sentence. Her face didn't change, but her silence was suddenly electric, like she'd just spotted her opening. Agnes quickly realized she'd said too much and tried to backtrack, claiming it was just preliminary discussions about general neighborhood enhancement, nothing concrete or binding. But the damage was done. Tessa was taking very careful notes now, and I could practically see the gears turning in her head. This wasn't just about power-hungry HOA overreach anymore. There was money involved, serious money, and Agnes had just given us a thread to pull on. Development groups are always interested in improving communities, Agnes said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the nervousness creeping into her voice. She knew she'd made a mistake, but she couldn't figure out how big a mistake it was. The meeting ended with Agnes and Blackwood convinced they'd completely broken my spirit. I played my final card perfectly, asking in a defeated voice if they could provide all the legal documentation proving they had authority to cut down my trees, and evidence that the trees definitely weren't protected by any existing laws. "I just want to understand where I went wrong," I said, looking as pathetic as possible. "Maybe if I can see the paperwork I can learn from my mistakes and make sure this doesn't happen again." Agnes agreed immediately, so confident in her position that she practically volunteered to hand over everything we'd need to hang her. Blackwood actually chuckled as they gathered their papers, like he was amused by my naive attempt to understand adult business. "We'll have our office send over all the relevant documentation," he said, and I could tell he was already mentally spending whatever bonus he thought he'd earned for handling this case so efficiently. They left that conference room thinking they'd just witnessed the complete surrender of a simple country boy who was way out of his league. If they could have seen the look on my face after they walked out, the cold, calculated smile of someone who'd just set the perfect trap, they might have thought twice about their victory celebration. The fish just swallowed the hook, I thought to myself as I watched them disappear down the hallway. The documents arrived by courier 3 days later, and Tessa dove into them like a detective investigating a murder case. The office smelled like old paper and coffee, and every time Tessa flipped a page, it sounded louder than it should have. She spread everything out across her conference table, internal memos, email chains, legal opinions, financial records, creating what looked like the evidence board for a major criminal investigation. What she found was even more damning than we'd hoped for. Buried in the HOA's internal communications was a memo that made my blood run cold. "This area is technically protected under old city ordinance, but if nobody digs up the paperwork, we should be able to proceed with minimal resistance." They knew. From day one, Agnes and her board knew they were breaking the law, but they'd gambled that I was too ignorant or too powerless to fight back. The memo was dated 2 weeks before the first violation notice was sent to me, which meant everything Agnes had done, the escalating letters, the legal threats, the actual tree cutting, was part of a deliberate criminal conspiracy. So from day one, they knew they were breaking the law, I said to Tessa, and she nodded grimly while highlighting passages in the document with yellow marker. I actually had to sit down. My knees went soft. She'd known. She'd known the whole damn time. "This isn't just negligence or ignorance," she said. "This is premeditated fraud." I felt sick reading those words, realizing that Agnes had looked me in the eye and lied to me repeatedly, knowing exactly what she was doing every step of the way. But that wasn't even the worst of it. Remember Agnes's slip about Evergreen Development? Tessa had spent the weekend digging into that connection, cross-referencing corporate filings and public records, and what she found turned my stomach. Hidden in Agnes's personal files, files she'd stupidly included in the document dump because she thought they were irrelevant, was a signed contract with Evergreen Development Group. Agnes was set to receive a substantial commission for successfully clearing my land and several adjacent properties for a luxury resort and shopping complex development. We're talking about enough money to fund a very comfortable retirement, all contingent on getting rid of longtime residents like me who stood in the way of progress. This wasn't just about HOA power trips or community standards. This was about money. Serious money, and Agnes had been systematically targeting longtime residents to force them off their land so developers could swoop in and build their profit machine. My trees, my family's 200-year legacy had been nothing more than obstacles to Agnes's retirement fund. "So this is the real kill shot," I told Tessa. "Not just power hungry, but money hungry, corruption." That's when Tessa decided to bring in the big guns. She contacted David McMillan, everyone called him Mac, the police chief who'd built a reputation as a straight-shooting, no-nonsense law enforcement officer who didn't care how much money or political influence you had if you broke the law on his watch. Mac was exactly the kind of old-school cop you'd want on your side, methodical, thorough, and completely immune to the kind of smooth-talking bullshit that corporate lawyers like Blackwood specialized in. He'd been chief for 15 years, and in that time he'd sent plenty of supposedly untouchable people to prison for thinking they were above the law. When he walked in, the room seemed to get quieter, like the law itself had entered. When Tessa laid out the evidence, the Protected Grove Ordinance, the internal HOA memos, the Evergreen Development Contract, Mac's expression grew darker and darker. He studied each document carefully, asking pointed questions about dates and signatures, building his case methodically like the experienced investigator he was. This isn't just property dispute anymore, he told us, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from decades of dealing with criminals who think they're smarter than everyone else. This is conspiracy to commit fraud, destruction of protected public property, and abuse of public office. I'm issuing arrest warrants. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning, and I have to admit, I made sure to be working in my yard when Mac and his team arrived at Agnes's house. I wanted to see her face when she realized that all her careful planning and legal maneuvering had collapsed around her like a house of cards. She came to the door in her bathrobe, clearly expecting this to be about a noise complaint or some other minor issue. But when Mac identified himself and started reading from the warrant, I watched Agnes's expression transform from annoyed confusion to absolute panic. "This is impossible," she kept saying, her voice getting higher and more desperate with each word. "This is some kind of conspiracy against me." The irony of Agnes claiming to be the victim of a conspiracy while being arrested for conspiracy was almost too perfect. Several neighbors had gathered to watch the spectacle, and I noticed they were keeping their distance from me now, like whatever had happened to Agnes might be contagious. But there was something else in their expressions too, a kind of respect that hadn't been there before, like they were finally understanding that maybe I hadn't been the crazy one after all. The moment that made everything worthwhile came when Mac officially read the charges. "Agnes Peabody, based on evidence we've collected, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of destruction of protected public property, abuse of public office, and conspiracy to commit fraud." The handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists with the most satisfying sound I'd ever heard in my life. But the real victory came afterward, when Mac walked over to my property with an official city placard that read, "Protected Historic Grove, established 1897, maintained by Municipal Conservation Authority." He hammered that sign into the ground right next to what remained of my family's oak trees, making the protected status official and permanent. I watched Mac read each word on that placard. Calm as Sunday morning tea, and me, I was finally tasting that first sweet sip of victory. Agnes was loaded into the police car, still protesting her innocence, while I stood in my yard holding those wood chips I'd saved from the destroyed trees. Watching Agnes get handcuffed, I wondered if this was really the end, or just the beginning of something much bigger than I'd ever imagined. The trial proceedings turned into a media circus that I never could have anticipated. Word had gotten out about the Protected Grove and Agnes's development scheme, and suddenly my little property dispute had become a symbol of everything people hated about corporate greed and HOA overreach. There were cameras everywhere, peeking through fences, leaning over gates. One reporter even tried to interview my chickens. Local news crews camped out on my property, reporters called my phone at all hours, and my story started showing up on social media with hashtags like Tree Justice and HO Overreach. Agnes and Blackwood faced serious criminal charges: destruction of protected public property, abuse of public office, conspiracy to commit fraud, and the evidence was so overwhelming that their defense strategy seemed to consist mainly of pointing fingers at each other and claiming they'd been misled by municipal bureaucracy. Evergreen Development immediately distanced themselves from the whole mess, claiming they'd been unaware of any illegal activities and canceling all contracts with Agnes. Watching these powerful people turn on each other like wolves was almost as satisfying as the handcuffs had been. Agnes tried to claim she was just following standard HOA procedures, while Blackwood insisted he'd relied on his client's representations about legal authority. She stopped dyeing her hair, her voice cracked on live TV, every inch of power drained off her face. Neither story held up under scrutiny, especially once the prosecution presented that damning internal memo, proving they'd known about the protected status all along. There was one tense moment during the proceedings when a city representative argued that they needed to verify complete ownership of the entire land area before granting full protection status. For about 10 minutes, I thought everything might fall apart again, that some bureaucratic technicality would snatch victory away from me at the last second. I was sweating bullets, watching the judge review property documents, while Agnes's lawyer tried to argue that the original ordinance might not apply to current zoning classifications because of changes in municipal authority over the past century. But Tessa had been thorough in her preparation, anticipating every possible challenge and having answers ready. She presented deed records going back to the original land grants, showing an unbroken chain of ownership and legal authority that stretched back to when my great-great-grandfather first settled this land. The judge spent what felt like hours reviewing everything, occasionally asking questions that made my heart skip beats, but finally ruled that not only was the protected status valid, but that it had been criminally ignored by people who should have known better. "This ordinance has been in effect for over a century," he said, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "Ignorance of existing law is not a defense, especially when evidence shows deliberate concealment of that law." The final judgment was everything I could have hoped for and more. Agnes was sentenced to 18 months in prison, with her reputation completely destroyed and her HOA leadership position permanently revoked. The judge made it clear that her actions weren't just illegal, they were a betrayal of the public trust that came with holding community authority. Blackwood lost his law license and faced substantial fines for participating in the conspiracy, with the State Bar Association making an example of him for other lawyers who might think about cutting corners when it comes to due diligence. The HOA itself was ordered to pay massive compensation for tree restoration and emotional damages, enough money to not only replant my grove, but to secure my financial future for years to come. But the real victory came when the state government stepped in and officially designated my oak grove as a protected historic landmark. Suddenly, my quiet little ranch became a recognized piece of American heritage, protected by laws that no future Agnes could ever circumvent. The designation came with funding for restoration and maintenance, turning my property into something that would be preserved for generations of my family and the general public alike. The transformation has been incredible in ways I never could have imagined. My property is now a popular destination for eco-tourists and researchers studying historic conservation, with a small but steady stream of visitors who come to see the grove and learn about the importance of preserving family heritage and natural landmarks. School groups visit regularly, and I've started giving talks about environmental conservation and the legal protections that exist for historic properties. The ranch is busier than it's ever been, but somehow it still feels peaceful, like the trees themselves are finally getting the respect they deserved all along. I've gained widespread recognition for my wood carving, with collectors specifically seeking out pieces made from branches that fall naturally from the protected grove. The steady income stream means I never have to worry about affording legal representation again, and I've been able to expand my workshop and take on apprentices who want to learn traditional carving techniques. There's something deeply satisfying about teaching young people to work with wood, to understand the grain and respect the material in ways that connect them to generations of craftspeople who came before them. I still sit under those surviving oak trees every morning with my coffee, but now there are new saplings growing where Agnes's chainsaws did their damage. The restoration project has been a labor of love, with experts from the State Forestry Department helping me select and plant trees that match the original grove as closely as possible. We've planted 12 new oaks, each one chosen for its genetic compatibility with the existing trees and its potential to live for centuries. I whispered thanks to the wind. Maybe my great-grandfather heard me. Maybe he always had. Sometimes I catch glimpses of Agnes in the local news, usually some pathetic story about her appealing her conviction or trying to rebuild her reputation, and I just smile quietly while sipping my morning coffee. 3 months ago, I thought I was just a simple woodcarver trying to save some old family trees. Turns out, I was fighting for something much more important, the right to preserve what truly matters, even when powerful people want to erase it for profit. Agnes taught me something incredibly valuable, even though I'm sure that wasn't her intention. When someone tries to steal your history, they're not just taking your property, they're betting you don't know your own worth. That was her biggest and most expensive mistake. Looking directly at you folks watching this story, I want you to remember something. Don't ever mess with country folks, especially when those country folks happen to live among trees that have been legally protected since the 1800s. That's my story, and sometimes the little guy actually does win, but only when he's got the law, the evidence, and just enough patience to let the bad guys hang themselves with their own arrogance. Who knows what other forgotten laws are buried in dusty boxes around this old place? I might just keep digging to see what else I can find. And hey, if you've ever had to stand your ground against a crooked HOA or some power-hungry neighbor, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. I hang out down there after every upload. If this story hit a nerve or gave you a little bit of hope, feel free to hit like or stick around by subscribing to QA Stories. We've got more where this came from. I never thought I'd be someone telling stories on the internet, but here we are. And honestly, it's folks like you listening that make it worth sharing. So thanks for sticking around, and if you've ever felt outnumbered, overlooked, or steamrolled by the system, just remember, sometimes all it takes is one old map, a little patience, and a whole lot of grit. See you next time.
QA Stories signing off for now, but the drama, it never sleeps. Tap that bell if you're ready for round 2.